Hungary's busy week. Budapest is on the eve of approving Sweden's NATO application. This week ending February 24, 2024, was a busy week for Hungary and their Prime Minister Viktor Orban, and is expected to reach its apogee early this next week. Most of the issues that have pushed Viktor Orban into the European center of attention over the last 2 years has been due to the Russian-Ukraine war. What the war in Europe, and before that the mass immigration flood from the Arab Spring, is it illustrates that Hungary and Viktor Orban bucked the philosophy of the European Union and most of its member states. Despite what his international critics say, this week was demonstrated that Orban does support Europe, but does so on his own terms. The 2-year anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine University came on February 24th. The European Union, which has been pro-Ukrainian throughout the war, wanted to issue a statement condemning the Russian invasion and to support of Ukraine and its determined resistance. Like many European Union decisions, it requires a unanimous support from all member states, and as has been the case in the past, Hungary vetoed the statement. The reason was not immediately clear, but considering that Hungary has a relatively positive relationship with Russia and continues to purchase oil and gas from Russia, Orban's Western loyalty was called into question. Orban's decision to veto the EU anniversary statement defies such a simple explanation of its critics, though. The European Union decided to sanction 3 Chinese and 1 Hong Kong company. The reason for these sanctions about China and Hong Kong companies is because the EU determined these companies were assisting Russia to circumvent existing EU sanctions. Hungary, with its favorable relations with China, taking Belt and Road Initiative funding, and with Russia, initially vetoed the sanctions. This week, Hungary lifted its veto and stated publicly that there was no reason to continue the veto, but it also stated that the EU decision to sanction the Chinese companies was not a correct decision. It appears that Hungary was not going to allow too much anti-Russian rhetoric coming from the EU, so the approval of the sanctions was in exchange for not approving the 2-year Ukraine war statement. This may seem cynical, but the balance that Hungary is trying to maintain a favorable relationship with Russia and consistent flow of energy, it cannot be seen as aligning too closely with EU's anti-Russian policies. The reason that Hungary and Viktor Orban needed this formality of vetoing the EU statement is because Orban was about to make more decisions that were not going to be seen as favorable to Russia. Sweden's application for NATO, which also requires a unanimous consent of all member countries, is being held up by Hungary. Hungary, being the last country to approve the application and being viewed as sympathetic to the Russian position by fellow European countries, is having a lot of pressure placed against it. By the end of January, Hungary receiving even more pressure into approving the Swedish application, but being the typical Hungarian style, it was not going to relent to all the pressure and would take public stands to show that it will not be giving in to everything that the European partners are demanding. When the pressure on Hungary to stop delaying the Swedish NATO application was at its crescendo, Orban agreed to Swedish admission and invited the Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson to come to Budapest to smooth over the relations between the two countries. The Speaker of the Hungarian Parliament, which is the same political party as Viktor Orban, insisted that the meeting between the two leaders needs to take place before Parliament votes on the Swedish application, which is the last Hungarian hurdle to the Swedish admission to NATO. Prime Minister Kristersson agreed in a letter to Orban, and they met on Friday, February 23rd, which was 3 days prior to the parliamentary vote scheduled for Monday, February 26th. Orban and Kristersson, as an olive branch, signed a defense agreement with Hungary, purchasing additional Swedish-made Gripen fighters. There was additional drama late in the previous week when a bipartisan group of U.S. senators arrived in Budapest after drafting a resolution condemning Hungary's commitment to democracy, to hold meetings with Hungarian officials to discuss the need to immediately act on Sweden's NATO application. This visit was more for grandstanding, as by late January it was apparent that a vote on membership would happen in late February. The Hungarian officials demonstrated their displeasure by refusing to meet with any of the senators. Orban and Hungary once again demonstrated that they will cooperate with Europe and NATO, but will do so in their way and will not be pressured into immediate compliance. Viktor Orban has been accused of being a difficult partner to work with in Europe And it is no secret he is largely despised in NATO and the EU, and is accused of seeking the spotlight on himself. Or he is criticized for being too close to Russia and China, which are fair criticisms, but it is not fair to state that he is anti-democratic because of the relations he has with two of the big anti-democratic countries. His public concerns about Ukraine's ability to win the war with Russia have legitimacy, mainly around demographic arguments, and may not be popular in Europe, but it does mean that by him stating a legitimate position does not make him more pro-Russian. The other accusation is that he is anti-democratic because he will block the will of the EU and NATO by using his veto power, even if he's the only one to yield it. Unanimous consent is in the rules for both NATO and the EU, so if Orban decides to use the power that both organizations grant Hungary, he cannot be called anti-democratic for using the tools that are well within his rights to use, even if he's the only one going out and willing to use the veto. The EU and NATO do not like to use the veto. They can attempt to amend it in their policies. However, one thing is clear, Orban is a leader of a small country, and it is easy to have its interests disregarded. So Orban will stand up for Hungary, but in the end, he usually agrees with the consensus, but will do so on his terms.